Hello everyone, this is Ryan, and in this lesson we're going to be looking at CSS dimensions. So you'll remember from our box model that the content area can have a width as well as a height. And that's what we're going to do in this lesson. We're going to experiment with widths and heights. So remember, the two main types of elements in HTML are your block level elements and your inline elements. So the heading, for example, is a block level element, which means by default it has a width of 100%, and the same goes with a paragraph. Whereas an image, on the other hand, is an inline element, and it has then a specific width and height. So let us experiment a little bit with these dimensions. If we go to W3 Schools, and we have a look at the section called the basic box, we will find a width property that we can set, as well as a height property. You'll also notice that there is a max height, which is for the maximum height, a max width, a min height, and a min width. So these are the 6 properties that we are going to experiment with. So let's go straight into the coding and start playing around with these dimensions. So I'm going to switch over to my CSS file, which has got some CSS left over from some of the previous videos we looked at. And then I'm going to just set the width on my heading to, let's say, 400 pixels. Now the live preview in brackets actually just puts an outline around it so you can see. But if it wasn't for that, we wouldn't actually see any difference. So I'm going to just maybe put a background color onto my heading, and we'll see it more easily. Okay, so if I comment out the width, you'll notice that it by default, because it's a block level element, it's always the full width of the browser. But if I set it to a specific width, it then limits it to that specific width. In the same way, I could change the dimensions of the images by also setting their width and heights, but generally it would not be a good idea to make the picture dimensions larger than the original size of the image. However, I could easily make it smaller if I wanted to. Okay, then the height of the content area is normally determined by the content that you have placed into that area. So for example, if we look at this paragraph over here, if I go to my inspector and I click on the paragraph, you'll notice that this particular paragraph has a height of 72 pixels. If I go to the paragraph below that, or the block quote below that, it has a height of 110. So every single paragraph is different. Remember, these two pictures are actually in a paragraph themselves. So if I go to the paragraph that's containing those two pictures, it has a much higher height. And it's just based on the content that's in that paragraph. So let's see if we set the height of the paragraphs by saying height 100 pixels. And let's also just give a background color to those paragraphs, just so we can visualize what's going on the page. Okay, so this is a bad example because every paragraph does have a different height by default. So you should not normally set the heights on all the paragraphs at once, rather set heights on individual paragraphs. And that we'll learn later on when we look at classes and IDs. But you'll see, for example, this paragraph has now got a height of 100 pixels. And in fact, every paragraph has a height of 100 pixels. So even the paragraph with the two images in has a height of 100 pixels. What we're getting here is what we call overflow. Overflow is when there's too much content for the height of a particular area. So as soon as you have too much content, there is overflow. And in fact, we do have a CSS property known as Overflow. And Overflow is got a couple of possible values. You can set it to hidden, which makes the overflow area invisible. You can set it to scroll, which will add scroll bars to that area. You can add it to auto, which will only add scroll bars if there is too much content for the area. And the default setting is just visible, which means that if there is overflow, it will overflow the content area. So let's see what happens if we add some overflow to our paragraph. Okay, so by default there is overflow. So if I switch the overflow off by making it hidden, notice what happens to the pictures. They've now been limited at that particular height of that paragraph. If I set the overflow to scroll, then we should then get scroll bars appearing on all our paragraphs, so that we can scroll through that paragraph. But you'll see the height is still set to 100 pixels. Okay, if we set the overflow to auto, then the scroll bars will only appear if necessary. So for example, the first paragraph now doesn't have any scroll bars, but the one with the pictures in does, because the content is overflowing. Okay, so you'll see that it does not make sense to have an overflow if you don't have a height, because as soon as I remove the height grows automatically to accommodate the content. And so now there's never going to be a situation where you're going to need scroll bars. So now we can actually completely remove the overflow property. Then the other properties we mentioned are the max height, the min height, the min width, and so on. So let us experiment. If I set the minimum width, let's use the minimum height as an example. If I set the minimum height of the paragraph to 200 pixels and I refresh, you'll notice that this paragraph is now 200, this is 200, but the one with the pictures in is actually larger than 200. Let's go on to that one. This one is 264. So it can exceed 200, it just must not be smaller than 200. In the same way, I can set the maximum height to 200. So now these two paragraphs are less than the maximum, so they then just use whatever height they need. But the one with the images, that's been limited to a maximum of 200 pixels in height. And in the same way, we can also set the minimum width and the minimum height. Okay, and using this is one way of making your site responsive. So for example, if I put a wrapper around my content on my page, let me just put a wrapper around everything on the page. I'll make a div with an ID of wrapper. Okay, so I've got a div opening here, all my content, and a closing div at the bottom. And then in the CSS, I'm going to just make a rule for the wrapper. And I will set the width to, let's say, 800, and I'll set the margin to auto. And that will center the layout in the middle of the page. Okay, so now you can see my layout centered in the middle of the page. Now what happens if I view this page on a mobile device? If I now start resizing my browser, you'll see that the image, the width is still stuck at the fixed width of 800 pixels, which is not appropriate for a mobile device. So to fix this on a mobile device, what we could do is we could set our width to 100%. So now we're using a percentage. And that will obviously set the width to the full width of the browser. So now, no matter what size I go to, it's always going to be 100%. But that's not quite what I want, because I still want on maybe larger screens to have the layout centered at 800 pixels. So what I can do then is just set a maximum width, so max dash width of 800 pixels. And now at lower resolutions it's the 100% of the screen, but as soon as I get to a wide enough resolution, it's now fixed at 800 pixels and it's centered in the screen. So you can see that by using a combination of a relative unit of measurement, which is percentage, and an absolute unit of measurement, we can actually allow our layout to accommodate multiple screen sizes. So that brings us to the end of the lesson on working with CSS dimensions.